Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcode.com with yet another intro to React video, because there can never be enough intro to React videos, right? So basically my goal here is to see how much of React, and again I have plenty of other React videos so you can learn more about React, how much React we can squeeze into 20 minutes. So bottom line, what is React? React is a front-end framework. It's going to allow us to construct our website and all of the interactivity on the front end sort of user interface from the front end. So unlike, let's say, using Ruby on Rails with embedded Ruby, or PHP with Blade script, with Blade templates, or even using EJS templates in JavaScript, or Jinja templates in Python, whenever you use a templating language, you're generating your website from like the server. So like the server generates an HTML page, sends it to the user, and as they go from page to page, you have to regenerate each page. So the server has to do this work of regenerating the page every page. With React, you can create what's called a single page application. You can also do this with Vue, Angular, Svelte, Solid.js, and several other frameworks. But essentially what's going on here is, with a single page application, is that instead you're just shipping an empty HTML file for the most part attached to a JavaScript file, and that JavaScript file, when it gets loaded in the browser, builds up your website. So the idea is we're shifting all that sort of construction that you would sometimes do with templating, and shifting that to be done in the browser instead of on the server. Okay, so the server isn't having to generate the page every time they go from page to page. Instead, is really just one page, thus single page application, but we create the illusion that the user is interacting with a multi-page website by just constantly changing what's on the screen. Cool, so now we know conceptually like what kind of React, Vue, Angular, all these frameworks do. The benefit of doing this is that it's much easier to control stateful logic, and there's also sometimes performance benefits as well. But the idea is like we can tie changes in the data that our front end depends on to it rebuilding itself, instead of us saying, okay, if the data changes, we're taking you to another page, we rebuild it based on, we get the data again and rebuild the page again every time you go from page to page. So how do we get started? The easiest way to generate a React project is to use something called Create React App. There are several React project generators. I've created some. There's some other really good ones out there. But the easiest way is to start with the official one. So we do npx create react app. And then you put the name of your app there. So we'll say my first React app. Okay. Then that's going to kickstart this Create React App generator. This is actually generating the project, because the project comes with all sorts of bells and whistles like Babel, ESLint, Webpack, all these things that actually create this environment for us to develop in React. How does that all work really doesn't matter for you to develop in React. We just need to know that the creators of this particular template, and again there's multiple templates out there, set this all this stuff up for us so we don't have to think about it. It's just going to work right out of the gate. Okay, so we get the benefits of this sort of really sort of high-end development environment without having to do any of the configuration. Nice. So now that the project's been generated, I'm going to cd my terminal into that folder, so that way my terminal is inside that my first React app folder. Okay, so you see now my terminal is in that folder. And what we can do is we can do npm start, and that's going to start the project. So that's always like runs what's called the development server. And what this does, it shows us the status of our React website, so we can actually see it, and it'll update as we make changes to it. So to kind of see what's going on, is everything we'll be working out of is this source folder. Okay, and then you also have this public folder. So if you need to like save any like images or anything like that, you can put them in here. Favicons and the actual index.html. So this is literally what gets shipped to the browser as your index.html, this thing. So see, it's a pretty empty website, because what happens is that the minute this page loads in the browser, a JavaScript file is going to get loaded. So we don't see that here, because essentially what happens is that gets built by everything we have in the source file. We can run a command npm run build that actually will build our project out after we're done making it. But essentially what happens is that essentially React is going to take and replace this div with a bunch of HTML that's generated through JavaScript. Okay? And then that's your website. And you'll be able to manage the logic of how that website updates in your JavaScript. So essentially JavaScript is your website in this situation. And that's generally how these single page application frameworks work. They hijack HTML's job and give that job to JavaScript. So if we go to source, you notice there's no HTML files anymore. It's just JavaScript files now. And everything generally starts with this index.js. So this is where we grab that div. So that div you saw in the HTML, we grab that div and we mount this. This is sort of like the entry point. And the main thing you have to kind of see here is that we're essentially whatever this app component is, and think of a component as a bundle of like JavaScript and HTML. And it's going to say, hey, I'm going to take this app component and inject it where that div is. So that's why we call it app, because essentially it represents your entire React application. Okay, and you notice how we can use it like an HTML tag. It looks like an HTML tag. This is what's referred to as JSX. Also referred to as JavaScript XML. No one really says it the long name. But it's kind of a cool syntax we can use when writing React code. So really, you have to think of this app JavaScript file. This app JavaScript file, this is your website. Essentially, what's going to show up on the page is whatever's inside this div. Okay, so see if I empty out that div, the website becomes blank. So every React component is really just a function. So see, it's just a function called app that returns JSX. That's all a component is. Okay, I can write components in other files, which is what typically is done. I could also just write a component in this file. So I could be like function header. Components should always be uppercase. Function header. And then I just say return and h1. This says hello world. And so now that I've written this component here, again, it's a function that returns JSX, which is just, it looks like HTML. Okay, the reason why it's not HTML, just to kind of show you, like if I write here like console.log header, just so you can see what happens. That's there's no such thing as header. Header. If I open up my terminal, see this is really, wait, let's go back over here, console. See this big like bunch of junk here? That's really what you're writing, okay? So that's really what happens. We write it like this, which makes a lot of sense and looks like normal HTML. But what happens is that when React builds it out, it uses Babel, which Babel is a transpilation tool to transpile new JavaScript to old JavaScript. Facebook, who created React, created a plugin for Babel that takes your JSX and turns it into like the real React code. No one ever writes this real React code because this would be torture. But basically what React looks like under the hood is this. Okay, so this jumble of stuff. Okay? So essentially, it's at the end of the day, it's really just JavaScript. But the idea is you're writing your JavaScript in a way that looks like HTML. So you're describing, you're saying, hey, React with JavaScript, make a chunk of HTML that looks like this. It doesn't actually, what it does, again, uses all this fancy React code under the hood to generate that result. So now that I have this function that returns JSX, again, which is, again, simplest way to think about it is just HTML. I can now use it. So I can go in here and I can use that component like an HTML tag. So let's see, now this is going to show up, hello world. Because whenever I write this syntax, I write a name like this. If it's capitalized, it assumes it's a component. So it's going to look for a function somewhere in all my files or in the same file that has that name that returns JSX. And it's going to run the function and then inject whatever HTML gets generated from that JSX into here. Okay, and that's pretty cool. So ideally, I'd probably put that in a separate file. So that way each file is one component. It's just more organized. But the idea is that as long as I write a function that returns JSX, aka HTML, I can then use that in another component or whatever. And the cool thing is that these components can communicate with each other. So for example, let's say I wanted to pass this header component, we'll call it a, cheese equals Gouda. So this is referred to, normally this would be referred to as an HTML tags attribute for HTML. But when we're talking about React components, this is referred to as a prop. So any props, when I use a component, so this is me using the component, and I'm passing it one prop, cheese, and that cheese prop equals Gouda. All those props actually get passed to the function. So what I can do is I can define props, so I'll just name a parameter called props, and now I can actually inject any props that this component is receiving into the HTML just by using curly brackets. So I'll just do props dot cheese. Okay, and see, there it goes. There's Gouda. Because again, a prop is anything just kind of passed in that way, and then it becomes available to the component that it's rendering. And I can use this component multiple times. And that's another really nice piece of making components. I can reuse them. And I can change the props each time I use them. So this time it's Munster or Munster. So you see, even though I'm using the same component, they're generating a slightly different output because the prop is different. So what you can do is you can make components that you can reuse, and they're customizable every time you use them because you can pass them different props. Okay, very cool, right? Now, so that's what props is. So props is the ability for whenever you use that component, you can pass it like some data. You can literally pass it anything, not just a string. You can pass it functions, you can pass it arrays of data, objects, whatever you want, and then that component can then make use of that data. Okay, so sky's the limit. The other cool thing you can do with a component is, we'll say counter. So we're going to create another component called counter. Again, what is a component? Just a function that returns JSX. Okay, so we're going to say h1 counter. Okay, cool. Now here's the thing. Imagine that I do this. I'm going to create a variable const, we'll say let counter equals 0. I can inject even variables that I define inside the function. I can use them in my JSX. So I'll just say this will equal counter. Okay, so see now, let me use this counter in the app component. Because again, app is what's being injected on the page. So I'm using, the only reason header shows up is because I'm using it inside of app, which shows up on the page. But let's say I inject counter. Actually, no, I'll just use it over here. I use counter over here. So counter. Okay, and let me change that to just self-closing. Counter. There we go. That looks nicer. So you see the count of 0. Now what I'd like to do is make that count up 1, 2, 3, 4. So what I do is I'll create a function. Const add 1. See, I'm creating it inside the counter function. So I have to put all the logic for that component in that component. The idea is to encapsulate, so each component is a reusable piece that kind of everything it needs is contained within it. That's also a reason why you try to put them in separate files. Okay, but I say add 1 equals a function, and all this function does is say counter plus equals 1. So it adds 1 to counter. And actually, let me wrap this in curly brackets. And then I console.log counter. So that way you can see the counter change. Okay, so this is a function, and I want this function to happen anytime I click on this h1. So I would just sit here in the HTML tag and do on click. Notice, unlike HTML, I don't type it all lowercase letters. For React, you want to do it in camel case for events. And to pass it the function, I'm going to use curly brackets and pass it the function I want to run when I click on that thing. So this just means anytime I click on this h1, run this add1 function. So if I click on it, now if I look here in the console, I can see that, yeah, counter is growing but the screen is not updating. Why? Because React doesn't know that it should update the screen. Okay? So we need to find a way to signal to React that, hey, data changed, our state, and you should update the screen. So to do that, you actually have to create the variable in a special way. So what we have to do is we have to import this special hook, which they're called hooks, from React. So this hook is called useState. Okay, from React. So we import this useState hook, and instead of declaring the variable this way, like we can declare variables this way if we don't need them to change. But if we expect the variable to change, and when it changes, the component should kind of rebuild itself to reflect the change, then we want it to be state. Okay, so that's what's special about state. They're variables that when they change, React will update things. So the way we would do this, we say const, and then we just say counter, set counter. We'll talk about what the set counter thing is in a moment. Okay, and then we say use state, and I'm creating a new variable that starts at 0. So what happens is I'm saying, hey, create a new state variable, make its initial value 0, and save it in here. Save that in there. Okay, so we're saving it inside the variable counter. Okay. So now let me refresh this. So now let me try clicking on it. Okay, now I'm getting an error when I do that. Why? Let's take a look. See, what happens is that this counter variable is technically constant. Okay, even if I change this to let, let's just change this to let just for giggles. Let's see what happens. See, it still changes the variable. So see, like I get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's still changing, but it's still not updating the screen. Okay, so that didn't fix it. I do have to create state, but you can't ever change the state directly. Like I can't just add 1 to counter. If I really wanted to update counter, what I have to do is use this set counter function. That's why we get that function. And then I put the new value of counter inside of there. So I would type in like counter. Ideal world, what you would do is you pass in a function inside of it. And the function starts off with the current value. So what I want to say is say, hey, you know, I want counter to now equal, okay, return counter current plus 1. This is the ideal way of doing it. The reason is you may have situations that are changing the same state concurrently, and this way it makes sure that it's always using the current state of the current context. So that way you don't end up having these weird unexpected state changes. So now what this does is that set counter runs the function, which gets past the current state, which is 0, and returns 0 plus 1. And watch what happens when I click it. See, it changed to 1. Now notice it console logged 0. Okay? So every time it changes, it console logs the number before it. Because technically, even though I'm updating the state, it didn't actually update the variable. What it does, it just trashes the component and rebuilds it from scratch. And in the new run of the function, it's getting the new number, but the old version of the function still has the old number. So this console log is still console logging the old value. So you have to be very careful with your console logs in that case. That you don't want to use a console log right after set state to show what the new state is. It's not going to work. Okay? So I wouldn't want to put that there. Okay? So in that case, generally, if you need to keep track of state changes, the best thing to do is to download React DevTools. So you can just go to Chrome extensions, look up the React DevTools extension, and you get this cool tool where I can see all the components in my app. I can click on counter, and I actually can see the state right there, and I can watch it change in the DevTools. And that's going to be a much more accurate way for me to track changes. Okay? So that's 20 minutes just about. Okay, otherwise, like watch my other React videos, but hopefully this gives you sort of a nice quick foundation in 20 minutes of how to start playing with React, the idea of components, props, and state, which are really just those foundational pieces. You can use CSS like normal. So you could just write global CSS right here in this index.css file. The only catch with that is that when you add classes to your HTML tags, you have to use the word class name instead of a normal class. So you write class name like cheese and then style that in your CSS. With that, now you should be off to the races. I'll see you later. Have a great day and enjoy.